A rented chateau in the Loire Valley, the 3rd of June, 1937. Inside its rooms, an American woman, twice divorced, buttons a narrow blue gown and prepares to marry the man who abandoned the largest empire on earth to have her. Every newspaper on the planet it calls the scene the finish line of the century's grandest romance. Then look closer at the guest list. The ceremony stays small, private, and pointedly avoided by the family she married into, because the British royal family already counted the couple as outcasts and would bar its door to them for decades. Days before she walked into that room, the King of England pinned a legal insult to her brand new title. Under the Great Seal, George VI ruled that his brother could keep the style of his Royal Highness, and that this woman could not. She would curtsy to a court that would never curtsy back. So the love story of the century opened with a legal snub and an empty church. That contradiction runs beneath everything that comes next. The woman marrying into the world's most famous romance did not, by the weight of the surviving evidence, want the throne, want the abdication, or even want this wedding. She aimed at something smaller and safer. She pursued it with such skill that it swallowed her whole. What Wallis Simpson constructed over 20 years of careful social climbing never resembled a fairy tale. She built a cell and filed down the key herself. To understand the prison, rewind to the poverty that shaped the prisoner. Long before any king or any crown entered the picture, a young woman in Baltimore absorbed a lesson that would steer the rest of her life. That a fine name without money buys nothing, and that a wedding might be the only real currency a girl in her position could ever spend. She learned it early. Wallace Warfield entered a proud old Baltimore family and almost none of its money. Her father died in her infancy, which left her and her mother leaning on the charity of a wealthy, controlling uncle, Solomon Davies Warfield, whose household ran on obligation and reminded her daily that a girl without means owned very few exits. Genteel poverty carries its own specific humiliation. The good name, the correct manners, the invitations arriving, and never the bank balance to answer them. At 20, she found an exit and grabbed it. In November of 1916, she married Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr., a pioneering United States Navy aviator, and the wedding handed her at once an escape from her uncle's roof and the standing of an independent married woman. Romance played almost no part in arithmetic. Anne Seba's biography reads these early choices as a pattern rather than a run of accidents. For Wallace, a marriage worked like transport, carrying her out of dependence and toward status, security, and a wider world. The wider world arrived, and then the marriage curdled. Spencer drank hard and turned violent, subjecting his wife to the verbal and physical abuse that Philip Ziegler's official history of Edward VIII records without flinching. Yet, even trapped inside a bad marriage, Wallace kept working the angles. She used her husband's naval postings, and a mid-1920s stretch in China above all, to assemble a worldly, polished persona, to learn the exact choreography of running a room, and to slide into the diplomatic and social circles that would matter to her later, long before the divorce cleared in December of 1927. By the divorce, the frightened Baltimore girl of a decade earlier no longer existed. In her place moved a hostess who could work a table of diplomats. That reinvention, and not the aviator, outlasted the marriage as its one durable product. Enter the man who could give her what Spencer never could. In July of 1928, she married Ernest Simpson, an Anglo-American shipping executive who divorced his own first wife to be with her, and Ernest supplied the very things the aviator denied her: money that stayed put, conversation that engaged her mind, and a calm that felt, after Spencer, close to luxury. Both Andrew Morton and Anna Pasternak read Ernest as the steady floor beneath her feet. He gave her an anchor she valued without pretense. From the flat at Bryanston Court, Wallace turned Ernest's stability into a launch pad. She hosted, she charmed, she gathered the right people, and her salons eventually pulled the attention of Lady Furness, the Prince of Wales's reigning mistress, who on the 10th of January, 1931, walked Wallis and Ernest into the royal orbit at a country house called Borough Court. Historians agree on the exact shape of her ambition. Wallis intended no divorce from Ernest. She meant to keep the marriage safe and use it as a base camp, a secure place to climb from into rooms the niece of Uncle Sol could never have entered on her own. Around 1934, the Prince of Wales fell for her. Here is where almost everyone, then and now, misreads the story, treating the years that followed as a woman's long campaign to seize a throne, when the surviving evidence points somewhere far more modest. The record tells a smaller story. The popular version says an ambitious American set her cap at a crown. The evidence says she aimed at something older and far more discreet. Ziegler and Seba both locate her real target in a very specific historical office, the maîtresse en titre, the openly acknowledged royal favorite, the woman a prince adores in full view of a court that quietly accepts the arrangement. That role carried everything Wallis chased since Baltimore, and none of the exposure of a throne. Weekend after weekend at Fort Belvedere, the prince's private retreat, she presided over his parties. Cartier boxes piled up. For a girl raised counting invitations she could not afford to return, the sight of the empire's most powerful bachelor hanging on her opinions worked like a drug. She also expected it to end, and the legend cannot absorb that expectation. Princes tire of favorites, and younger women arrive to shove the older ones aside. Wallis understood that mechanism perfectly, and wrote about it with a bluntness no scheming would-be queen would commit to paper. In a 1935 letter to her aunt Bessie Merriman, she measured the affair with the cool eye of a woman reading a weather forecast. What a bump I'll get when a young beauty appears and plucks the prince from me. Anyway, I'm prepared. That is not the voice of a schemer angling for a coronation. That is a woman planning for the day the ride jerks to a stop, already bracing for the fall. Years later, in her 1956 memoir, she polished the same idea into a tidier self-defense, insisting the flattery of a prince's company simply carried her somewhere she never planned to go. I was flattered, naturally, that the Prince of Wales should find me an amusing companion, but it never occurred to me that this friendship would develop into anything more serious. Read the memoir with a raised eyebrow, because a woman writing her own legend has every reason to stand off the ambition, and this one stands hard, recasting a careful climb as a string of pleasant accidents that simply befell her. Even so, the self-portrait fits the private evidence better than the tabloid one. Wallis wanted to be adored, decorated, and useful to a prince, and a queen's crown never entered the plan. Now the trap starts to show its teeth. The sharpest evidence against the whole legend of a scheming homewrecker sits, awkwardly, in Wallis's own handwriting, inside letters she never meant a single stranger to read. She wrote them to Ernest. While Edward pressed her to divorce Ernest and belong to him alone, Wallis kept writing, in secret, to the very husband she supposedly wanted gone. Michael Bloch published those letters in 1986, and Anne Seba folded them into her account in 2011. Read together, they wrecked the picture of a woman steering events toward a royal wedding. A split runs through these months. 2 days before her divorce trial opened at Ipswich in October of 1936, she confided to Ernest a dread that reads nothing like triumph. I feel small and licked by it all. I am so lonely, and I do not understand myself, which was the cause of all the misery. The panic deepened. Weeks later, on the 30th of November, marooned in exile and waiting for the machinery of divorce to grind forward, she wrote to him again, mourning the ordinary life she could feel slipping past recovery. Wasn't life lovely, sweet, and simple? I can't believe that such a thing could have happened to two people who got along so well. At least it never should have been like it is now. Read the date and read the name of the man she chose to write to. In the exact season when the entire world pictured her reeling in a king and angling for a throne, Wallis Simpson grieved a shipping executive in a quiet London flat she could feel slipping away. Her prison, at that moment, still held walls she could see over. Very soon it would grow a roof. Everything Wallis balanced so carefully rested on one condition: that the man doting on her stayed a prince rather than a king. In January of 1936, that condition collapsed. King George V died, Edward climbed the throne as Edward VIII, and the comfortable arrangement of a favorite and her royal admirer detonated into a constitutional crisis that pitched one obsessed monarch against the entire British state. The problem lay in what the new king now wanted. Edward decided he would marry Wallis, a twice-divorced American, and he would do it in defiance of the royal family, of the Church of England he now governed as supreme head, and of his own prime minister, Stanley Baldwin. None of them would bend. A king could not wed a divorced woman with two living ex-husbands and keep his crown. And Edward, deaf to every warning laid in front of him, kept insisting he could pocket both. Wallis, unlike Edward, could read a room, and what she read frightened her. As the newspapers turned hostile and death threats began landing, she took the step that sits so awkwardly beside her reputation as the woman who stole a king. She ran, and then she tried to call the whole disaster off. In early December of 1936, she fled to England for the Villa Louviers in Cannes, the home of her friends Herman and Catherine Rogers, and from that borrowed refuge, she moved to shut the crisis down rather than win it. On the 7th of December, working hand in glove with the king's own advisor, Lord Brownlow, she drafted a formal statement, cleared it, and released it straight to the press for the whole world to read. Its language leaves little room for the scheming temptress reading. Mrs. Simpson throughout has wished to avoid any action or proposal which would hurt or embarrass His Majesty or the throne. She is willing, if such action would solve the problem, to withdraw forthwith from a situation that has been rendered both unhappy and untenable. Withdraw forthwith. That is a woman trying to sprint out of her own love story before it finished closing around her. Brownlow confirmed afterward that the statement meant precisely what it appeared to mean, and that Wallis burned hours on the telephone from Cannes, begging Edward not to abdicate, warning him he would come to hate the empty life waiting on the far side of the crown. Edward would not listen, and he held a weapon that pinned her in place. Both Ziegler and Seba document the threat he used. He told Wallis he would kill himself if she left him. In her letters, she admitted she needed to deceive him about her plans, steering around his erratic, suicidal pressure the way a driver hugs the inside of a cliff road. Ernest, watching from London, with a clarity that must have ached, wrote to her the question buried underneath the entire catastrophe. Would your life ever have been the same if you had broken it off? I mean, could you have settled down in the old life and forgotten the fairyland through which you had passed? My child, I do not think so. On the 10th of December, 1936, Edward signed the instrument of abdication and told the world he could not carry his duties without the help and support of the woman I love. With one broadcast, he accomplished what the palace, the church, and the press never could. He bolted the door. No longer a divorcee weighing her options, she became overnight, in every newspaper on earth, the American adventuress who cost Britain its king. And a woman branded that way keeps exactly one move on the board. Marriage became her only choice, because a jilting now would look like betrayal on top of ruin, and history would fit her for an uglier crown than the one she refused. The wedding at the Château de Condé on the 3rd of June, 1937, opened the sentence rather than a honeymoon. It bought her nothing she wanted. Wallis now belonged, for the rest of her natural life, to a man she felt fondness and obligation toward, but never the sacrificial passion the whole world assigned her, and she belonged to him inside an exile with no parole date and no appeal. The state left her no illusions about her rank. Days before the wedding, on the 27th of May, King George VI issued letters patent under the Great Seal, granting his brother the title Duke of Windsor and the style His Royal Highness, while expressly withholding that style from the Duke's wife and from any children the couple might have. Edward kept his HRH, while Wallis would bow and receive no bow in return. The snub gutted Edward, who spent much of his remaining life petitioning, lobbying, and sulking over a title the crown never intended to grant, and for Wallis, it delivered the final joke of the entire bargain. She paid in public revulsion and lifelong confinement, and the law stripped the one prize that might have justified that price before the marriage even began. Then came the exile itself, stretched thin across Paris, the French Riviera, and a strange wartime posting in the Bahamas. The Windsors entertained the International Cafe Society, still willing to have them, while the British establishment and the royal family kept the door barred. Wallis found herself the permanent hostess, secretary and nurse to a bored ex-king with no job, no purpose, an ocean of empty hours he expected her to fill, and, by the biographer's reckoning, little in the way of inner resources to fill them himself. She wanted the favor of a prince who would go home to his palace by Monday. She married a man who never left. Consider what the shunning meant hour by hour. Invitations from the respectable world dried up, the court she climbed toward for years closed to her for good, and the family that once ran an empire simply behaved in public and in private as though the Duchess did not exist. What survived amounted to a circuit of resorts, dinner parties, and dress fittings, a life of relentless leisure with no duty planted inside it to give the days a shape. For a woman who spent her whole youth engineering her way into better rooms, the outcome carried a bleak symmetry. She scaled the ladder at last and found it propped against a wall with nothing behind it. Edward, cut loose from the throne, shrank into something no romance novel prepared her for. His devotion soured into a regressive, clinging dependence, and biographers describe him treating Wallis less like a wife than like a stern mother he could not function without. Part of the imbalance ran deeper than habit. The contemporary diarist, Lady Cynthia Gladwin, recorded a widely shared verdict that Edward carried sexual problems into the marriage, unable to perform, besotted and obsessed, rather than a settled adult partner. Whatever its precise source, the dependence expressed itself in ways guests could watch. He trailed her from room to room, surrendered control of his schedule, his clothes, his friendships, and his whole waking day, and then he waited for her approval, like a boy stationed outside a headmistress's office. Her patience frayed in public, and the record of it makes uncomfortable reading. Andrew Morton collects the evidence. At a nightclub, she snapped "buzz off, mosquito" at her adoring husband. And when he completed some tiny errand lighting her cigarette, say, she would ask the surrounding room, "Has little man done his duty?" The grimmest scene sits at a dinner table. Stranded in silence, with nothing left to say to one another, the Duchess would order the Duke to recite the alphabet, while she nodded and gestured with theatrical animation, so that diners nearby would glance over and picture the legendary couple still lost in glittering conversation. That performance never once stopped, because she could not afford to end it. Divorce fell outside possibility, and public complaint with it, since either would confess to a watching world that the largest royal renunciation in modern memory bought nothing at all, and would recast Wallis from tragic lover into the most expensive mistake in the history of the monarchy. So she stayed, and she smiled, and she kept the show running for decades. The whole exhausting sum collapsed into a single sentence she let slip to friends in Paris. "You have no idea how hard it is to live out a great romance." An honest account must admit that historians do not march in one direction on Wallis Simpson. 3 rival readings pull against the prison thesis, and each one, taken seriously and on its own terms, supplies a real reason to doubt that she ever built the prison she died in. Each deserves a hearing. The oldest reading is the romance itself, built largely on Edward's ghost-written 1951 memoir, A King's Story, and on Michael Bloch's early framing in the 1980s. This version treats the abdication as the purest sacrifice. 2 people so in love that a man surrendered an empire and a woman braved global hatred to stand at his side. Her own correspondence undoes it. Set the public romance beside the private panic of late 1936, beside Withdraw Forthwith and I Feel Small and Licked by It All, and the devotion the world admired starts to look less like passion and more like loyalty conscripted by circumstance. A second reading casts Wallis not as architect, but as scapegoat. Anna Pasternak argues that Baldwin, Archbishop Cosmo Lang, and the palace wanted Edward gone regardless, unnerved by his erratic conduct, his taste for meddling in politics, and his sympathies for fascism, and that the establishment simply weaponized a twice-divorced American to shove out a king they already distrusted. Real force sits in that argument, yet it does not clear her, because nobody forced the role of royal favorite onto Wallis against her will. She courted the king's exclusive attention, accepted the jewels and the weekends and the patronage, and never once reckoned on the detonation waiting at the end of that road. Pasternak frames the abdication as a quiet constitutional coup, a palace and a cabinet and a church quietly agreeing that this king must go and reaching for the readiest lever to remove him. Grant the whole mechanism. The lever still needed to be a real person standing in a real blast zone, and Wallis placed herself there of her own accord, one calculated social step at a time, long before Baldwin or the Archbishop ever needed her. The third reading is the strangest, and it belongs to Andrew Morton. In Wallis in Love, Morton proposes that Wallis never truly loved Edward or Ernest at all, but carried a torch her entire life for Herman Rogers, the married Yale man who sheltered her in cans. Morton cites a claim that she proposed to bear Rogers' child on the eve of her wedding to Edward, and reports that in 1950 she told Rogers' second wife, "He's the only man I've ever loved." If accurate, the theory darkens the prison in another shade, chaining Wallis for life to a needy former king while her heart stayed elsewhere. If accurate. Hugo Vickers and Michael Block treat the childbearing story as third-hand hearsay and note that any physical romance between Wallis and Rogers rests on nothing sturdier than proximity and gossip. Now the myths, and there are some ugly ones. Several of the things everyone knows about Wallis Simpson, the sort of claim repeated so often it hardens into common sense, dissolve the instant anyone with an archive card bothers to check them. Take the China dossier. For decades, a rumor insisted that during her 1920s stay in China, Wallis worked in singing houses or brothels, mastered exotic sexual techniques with names like the Shanghai gesture, and used them to enslave the king in bed, all of it supposedly logged inside a secret British intelligence file. Seba, Vickers, and Pasternak hunted for that file, and it does not exist in any archive, and never did. The whole tale reads as a misogynist smear invented by 1930s insiders who could not stomach the possibility that an older American commoner might captivate a monarch with wit and attention rather than sorcery. Take the question of her body, which the serious biographers handle with far more care than the rumor mill. For years, the gossip cast her as intersex by birth, or as a virgin who died having never managed the act at all. In that woman, Anne Seba weighs whether Wallis may have lived with a disorder of sex development, specifically androgen insensitivity syndrome, pointing to a documented cluster of traits. She never menstruated, endured lifelong sterility and painful intercourse, carried an angular, hard-edged physical presence, and suffered acute anxiety about her physical adequacy. Seba stays cautious where rumor runs reckless. Absent medical records or DNA, the diagnosis remains a hypothesis rather than a finding, and Seba states as much. Take the Nazi legend. Popular history paints Wallis as an active German spy, funneling secrets to Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, who supposedly mailed her 17 carnations a day, one for each night the two of them spent together. Major biographers throw out the Ribbentrop affair and the espionage charge as wartime gossip dressed up as fact. What survives scrutiny is bad enough without embellishment. Edward and Wallis toured Nazi Germany in October of 1937, shook Hitler's hand at Berchtesgaden, and Edward carried defeatist, pro-German opinions through the war, a record preserved in the captured German Marburg files. Biographers land on the least flattering and most human reading of her part in it. Wallis walked that red carpet out of social hunger and naivete, chasing the royal welcome Britain denied her, not out of any coherent fascist conviction. The last act played out in a Paris bedroom in the spring of 1972. It answered the one question the whole legend spent 40 years dodging, whether, stripped of the cameras and the crowds, any of it ever amounted to love at all. The answer arrived without mercy. Edward, Duke of Windsor, lay dying of throat cancer, and his night nurse, Julie Chittard Alexander, watched the great romance in its final form. The Duchess did not come to his room. She never sat with him, never kissed him good night, never held the hand of the man who threw away a throne for the daily privilege of her company. Instead, the dying Duke called out into the dark for the wife 2 doors away, over and over, "Wallis, Wallis, Wallis." The nurse could only compare the sound to a lamb crying for its mother. Sit with that arrangement one more time. The man the world adored turned out, to the people who worked beside him, to be a difficult and hollow figure, while the woman the world hated turned out, to her own household, to be loyal, gracious, and worth adoring, exactly as Hugo Vickers observed. The public read the whole thing inside out. Wallis herself helped keep it that way, because a confession would have cost her more than the lie ever did. Wallis Warfield never wanted the crown. She wanted a comfortable, temporary seat at the side of a prince, and she played that hand with a card-sharp's precision, won her round, and then lost the rest of her life to the winnings. Edward's abdication freed no great love. It welded a nervous American social climber to a broken ex-king and dropped the 2 of them into 40 years of gilded exile that neither one could walk out of. Her prison held no bars a photographer could capture. It held a wedding ring, a withheld title, a silent dinner table, and an old man in the next room calling out a name that would never answer.